Hello and welcome. All right, so I've been thinking lately about Valve and how they conduct their business. Now, before I get to that and to that point, I want to provide some context from my point of view. At the moment, I'm in my early 40s. I've been playing video games pretty much as long as I can remember. Started out on the Commodore 64 computer system, and the Intellivision console was the main console I was playing. I was far too young to be any good at those games, but I still remember playing and having absolutely no idea what I was doing in like a game called Infiltrator on the Commodore 64. I remember being kind of mind blown by a game called Spike for the Vectrex, where the character actually had some voice synthesizing going on. The Nintendo Entertainment System is really where I got into gaming, though. At the time, I was able to beat the first Mario game, Mike Tyson's Punch Out. I was way too young still to understand the RPG mechanics of Zelda 2. By the time the Super Nintendo came out, my parents were kind of instilling the idea into me that you have to earn things. So I ended up doing a lot of chores and doing, lawn mowing and stuff to save up money, and I ended up buying the SNES and the Super Mario World bundle. Once I bought that, I played the shit out of it, and the best part of it was mine, right? I owned it. So I still have that SNES, still have the games. I can play them anytime I want to. At this point, you know, thieves, acts of nature, or the thing wearing out are the only things that can deprive me of those. So by the time I was in my early teens, in the mid to late 90s, my parents bought their first computer since the Commodore 64. So I got into PC gaming at that time. Uh, games were already coming with CD keys by this point, so as long as you kept those CD keys and you took care of the disc you had, you owned that game, or at least the right to that game. That was status quo for the time. This is my copy of Diablo 2. The CD key and discs are all pristine, and most importantly, they are still mine. And as you can see in the limited use license, this is pretty much standard fare for agreements at the time. I bought the exclusive right to install and use one copy of the game. Aside from the BattleNet terms listed, the terms for the game itself are quite simple. There are other sections about you not owning the contents, just the right to use the game, the right to transfer ownership to another person as long as you uninstall yourself and do not keep any copies, things like that, and that was all standard fare. And just to show as well, I was able to install this game. I'm using Linux, so getting it to actually play through Proton took like downloading a wrapper to be able to get it to work with Proton properly, and there was some graphical glitches, but I'm pretty sure if I had bothered to put the time in, I could probably figure that out as well. But the point is, I can still play this game that I bought in the early 2000s. It's still mine. I can still play it. So in my early 20s, I went to college, and at this point, that was when I first heard of Valve. I had missed the first Half-Life entirely, so that was completely, you know, off my radar. And I got to college, and the hype for Half-Life 2 was pretty much palpable. At the time, though, I didn't bother getting it. I held off until later in 2026 or 2006, sorry. And at that time, I still hadn't even heard of Steam. So, as you can see on the back of this box, there is no mention of Steam, anything to do with the internet, nothing like that. The card inside details the CD install process. No mention of Steam there either. Just the CD and the CD key. Once you get the disk in, though, Steam.exe is in there. The license agreement, when you run the installer for the game, initially states that it is an agreement to the Steam agreement. It is not about the game itself. It later states that the program is licensed, not sold. Your license confers no title or ownership in the program or copies thereof. And this was not normal for the time. And in my opinion, this is when Valve committed what I'm going to call their cardinal sin within the gaming industry. They were relying on people to not read those agreements and just assume that Valve is following the standard practices that every other company was following and had been following for, 40 years by this point. And that's what happened. So Valve was able to use that to sneak this in and begin the process of making this into the new normal, new in quotation marks. So in my mind, this is when Valve broke the social contract that had existed between game companies and customers since the invention of video games. On the side of companies, the balance of power shifted entirely to them. On the customer side, we were unwittingly still giving our money with the expectation of owning a copy, and that was now an illusion. The same as I did with Diablo 2, I tested installing this version of Half-Life 2, and though I can't say for certain, I am assuming there must have been an internet backend requirement for this installer that's no longer active, because I'm unable to click the required options to accept the agreement or to continue with the installation. I can't even get far enough to be asked for the CD key that I paid for. So as such, this entire game package and all of the discs in it are nothing more than a paperweight. And I cannot remember exactly when, but a few years ago I remembered reading Steam community posts from the mid 2000s asking how customers would be able to back up their library in the case of Steam ever shut down. Valve never gave any official answers at the time, aside from support staff alluding to a process that would be announced if it was ever needed. Customers were theorizing that they would be able to provide a way for people to get copies of all their CD keys, among other things. Since it had been a few years, I got to wondering if they ever answered that, and I started looking into it, and I quickly realized that there was no such thing, and they were no longer hiding it. There's nothing to back up, because you don't own anything as far as they're concerned. That got me thinking about when I first installed games that I bought from Valve. I could right-click on them, and I had the option to see the CD keys for them. When I checked Half-Life 2, I found that menu option was no longer there. Looking into it, the best I can find is that between 2010 and 2013, Valve retired the versions of the games that had CDs attached to them and removed them from customers' libraries, replacing them with the Steam You Own Nothing versions. I then got to checking some older games I had bought that were not Valve's games. Looking again now, it appears that things have not changed since then, so I'm going to show some of what I still see now, such as Mass Effect, which still has the CD keys option, but there is no CD key listed. Some others, like Neverwinter Nights 2 Platinum, still show the CD keys. Others were removed from my library, the same as Valve's games were, and also replaced with You Own Nothing versions. Heroes of Might and Magic 5 is a comical example of this because the main game was replaced, but the expansion pack, Hammers of Fate, was not, but the expansion pack Tribes of the East was. So I have one expansion pack that still shows a CD key, while the main game and other expansion pack do not. Company of Heroes added a replacement version, but did not take the original version away. Instead, they renamed it to Legacy Edition. And for them, taking that approach when they had no obligation to, I would say thank you very fucking much. So I'm not sure if BioWare meant to or not, but they also left the original version of Dragon Age 2, though it was renamed to have retired on the end of it. It can still be installed and it still shows the CD key, but the name makes me think that some intern may have been meant to pull it from libraries and forgot to push the button. But either way, thanks, I think. With these changes that Valve spearheaded, we customers also face the new and improved trap that the end user license agreements had become. Before Valve, the EULA that you saw when you first installed the game was the only one you were ever going to see. Unless you downloaded a patch, but as far as I can tell, that agreement was for the patch content only, not for the main game. There was no new EULA or EULAs that may change at any time. Now customers today are like Lando Calrissian in Star Wars, praying that Darth Vader, after altering the deal, doesn't alter it any further. So right now I'm showing you the EULA for Grain Sim as an example. And I can't say for 100% certain, but I do not remember this game even having a EULA that I had to agree to when I first bought it, in quotes with bought, I mean. The last time I went to play it, I was greeted with a EULA that I have to accept to be able to launch it. And I'm not a fan of developers adding terms to an existing agreement. So I decided to try to request a refund for this game, despite being over the 2 hour playtime. As you know, I don't recall there ever being a EULA I had to agree to before. Why should I have to accept one already now for something I've already this is a done deal. Valve rejected that, of course, because I was over the 2 hours of playtime, which I was expecting. I've seen multiple Steam community posts, Reddit posts, etc., over the years of people discussing this topic, and that was pretty much the end result every time. Other people have tried as well. But to me, I see this as leaving customers with three courses of action. Like, you can either remove the game from your library forever with no monetary compensation. And the core word there would be that you're choosing to remove the game from your library, because if you choose to do that, It's removing any suggestion that you were deprived of something that you paid for because you're the one who chose to remove it. Secondly, you can accept that the only power you had in this relationship was the initial choice of whether to spend your money and whether or not to refund it within the first 2 hours of playtime. After that, you were bent over the table and at the mercy of the developer. And at that stage, you just either accept the EULA, you just accept the EULA, whether it's detrimental to you or not, for no other reason than to extend the access for what you already paid for, even if it's just for a little bit longer. And the last option is to just do nothing. Your money's wasted, the game's going to sit in your library as long as your Steam account continues to exist, and it's a reminder to stop touching the stove that has already burned you. And though I may eventually take the second option, but right now I've still got Drain Sim sitting in my library in a EULA limbo. And to me, this shines a spotlight on the fallacy, I would say, of the buying transaction with Valve and through Steam. Uh, customers think that they're buying a product, and they have that mindset by default. Even once customers think that they understand that they're buying a temporary license, they still think that they're entitled to use the product for the lifetime of that product, and that's not correct either. What you're really doing is renting access that relies solely on the mercy of that developer, and they have no obligation to deliver that. They reserve the right to remove access at any time they please in a lot of these agreements. So for the first 2 hours of gameplay, customers have the complete power to save themselves from this arrangement. And after 2 hours, all of the power shifts to the developer, and the customer is then just a piggy bank that's already been drained. And at that point, they only matter if the developer chooses to treat them as if they matter, but they have no obligation to do that. So once I realized that situation with Steam, I started looking for alternatives, and I've really only found two that I would consider to be feasible options. First one is pirating, but I'd prefer to avoid that. I actually want to uphold my end of the customer seller social contract in which I pay for the product and the seller provides me a permanent copy of said working product. Second option I found was Good Old Games, or GOG. This is a storefront where the games are DRM free and you can download the offline installers for any game that you buy. As long as you keep those files, no matter what happens, doesn't matter if GOG ceases to exist, if your government shuts down the internet in your country, doesn't matter if you're a damn astronaut and you take your PC to space. If you have those files, you can use the game. There's no punishments for installing on multiple systems. There's no internet required to activate. No other bullshit. That made GOG the obvious best solution in my mind, but there's a huge caveat. A lot of developers and publishers have no interest in upholding their end of the customer-seller social contract. They want your money, but they do not want you to own anything. A lot of them do not even care if their products work when they sell them. Sell in quotation marks. The developers, these developers and publishers will never sell their games on GOG. They would rather push performance destroying DRM and punish paying customers with online requirements and risk of loss, while in turn promoting piracy when customers see that pirated DRM free games are enjoyed without the punishment paying customers have to deal with. And trying to stick with GOG can be challenging in other ways sometimes as well. For example, developer Nihon Falcom, they were working with XSEED Games as their initial publisher for the first 5 games of their Trails, Legend of Heroes Trails series. And then they worked with NIS America as the publisher for another 8 games, which to this point they have released 13 mainline games in this series, both on Steam and GOG. They recently released a 3D remake of the first game, however, using Gung Ho Online Entertainment as the publisher. And I had never heard of this publisher before, but based on comments and forums I have seen, they seem to be notoriously pro DRM and anti GOG, and they made the decision not to release that remake on GOG. Thus, anyone who has the entirety of this series in their library via GOG and would like to have this game as well, they now have 3 options. They can either split their library and rent it on Steam, they can pirate it, or they can go without. Now, I'm an avid fan of this series. I've put many, many hours into all 13 of the mainline games, and I chose to forego the 3D remake because I can see that I am not a customer to this publisher, I'm a wallet. And, if the developer decides to switch to this publisher for what might be the final game closing out the 14-game storyline, all GOG fans of that series are going to be left with this conundrum on the mainline game, right? And lastly, where I'm a Linux user, both on my main PC and my Steam Deck. The other caveat is that I need to use Valve's Proton to run the games that I buy on GOG, since that's a Windows-only platform. So I expect everyone watching this probably knows what Proton is, but just in case, Proton is probably Valve's single greatest contribution to PC gaming. As I understand it, Proton acts as a translation layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux-based computers. This has opened up PC gaming on Linux, and while it hasn't had like a massive impact yet, it does introduce the possibility of freeing PC gamers from Microsoft's chokehold. Back on point, because I use the Steam Deck, I also want to use GOG's Cloud Save feature for games that make use of it. What I ended up doing because of that is using Proton to install and run GOG Galaxy, which is GOG's equivalent to Steam, on both my PC and my Steam Deck. I'm not going to bother getting into the specifics of making that work, but the point is that while GOG offers the store experience I'm looking for, I would not be able to use that without Valve's work with Proton. And alongside Proton, Valve has done a lot of great things for both gaming and gamers. Steam's review and player account system, while not perfect, is probably the best, most easily accessible set of data that gamers can access for making pre-spending decisions. Valve's rejection of in-game advertising, attempting to hold developers accountable for season pass promises, and requiring AI disclosures also are all consumer-first approaches. I like all of those things. But I cannot help but think of gamers collectively hating on Ubisoft executive Philippe Tremblay for his infamous interview stating that gamers need to get comfortable not owning their games. I still see this referenced very negatively 2 years later as people wish Ubisoft to collapse in online posts. Yet he stated that in 2024, nearly 14 years after Valve had already quietly retired products on their store that had a CD key attached and entirely swapped to a you will own nothing and you will like it approach. Valve had already hoodwinked their entire consumer base silently and so effectively that Ubisoft was talking about it that long later as if it was a new concept. In my opinion, every pro-consumer thing that Valve has done has been built on the foundation of that cardinal sin. They tricked multiple generations of gamers who thought they were investing into a library of games that they would own, when in reality they were funding Valve's growth in return for temporary rentals. I am happy to acknowledge that they have made incredible contributions, especially with Proton, but at the end of the day, it is my opinion that no amount of good deeds from them will ever make up for the damage that they have done to this industry. I believe that Ubisoft deserved every bit of notoriety they got and received for that previous comment, and I believe that Valve deserves more notoriety for quietly pulling that same thing off on their entire consumer base years earlier without anyone even noticing. So where do we go from here? Probably downhill. I would love to see Valve switch Steam to a you own what you buy approach, but I'm not naive enough to ever hope for that. I'd love it even more if developers would release their games on good old games, but far too many developers would rather promote piracy than remove DRM. Personally, I will still be using Steam to launch Proton, to launch games using Proton. I will still be renting some titles that I absolutely want to play on Steam that I know will never be on GOG. When I get those, I'm just going to have to accept upfront that I'm not investing in my own library of games. Otherwise, anything I want to buy that I can get on GOG, I'm going to be getting it on GOG. And for anyone that's watched this video to this point, I'm not making any suggestions of you. I'm not going to ask anything of you. I just only hope that I gave you something worth thinking about today. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching.